Okay, so this video is going to be in furtherance of the video I made on the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. Over the last day, on and off, I've got a life outside cyberspace, but on and off, I have been in sometimes pretty heated exchanges with Chinese netizens, that is to say, Chinese internet users, who have been on the page of the journalist Amanda Connolly. I already spoke about the details of this particular case in the previous video, so I'll just outline them. Basically, she was a Canadian journalist. She asked Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi a question about human rights, and online Chinese nationalists have went into overdrive in terms of their anger and their super sensitivity. I got into that forum in order to stand up for her, but from a wider point of view, stand up for the principle of a free press. Um, it's not a case of saying the press is perfect. It's not a case of saying the press can't be criticised. But the principle of a free press is an absolute hallmark of democratic societies. Um, I suppose I'm partly also defending a sister nation. I have a lot of respect for Canada. I think it's a great country. And I feel this journalist was doing her job in her country. And the backlash is pathetic, basically. Um, there is a lot of things I want to say. First, I'm going to just make a quick point, and I say this on a lot of related videos. Um, if your first response to this is to think that I am against all Chinese people, or that I'm even racist, which is just not the case, then there's not much I can do. Or you can listen to me, or you can think I'm full of crap and not bother listening to me. This particular video, I'm not going to make as a debate forum. Most of my videos are open. Most of my videos I allow different points of view. But this video, quite frankly, I just want to express my own point of view. That's it. There's plenty of spaces both on my channel and on cyberspace for different viewpoints. But to be honest, I'm drained of it now. I've tired myself out with arguing back and forth with so many people, and it's become draining. So I just want to basically outline everything with this. That's it. If you do disagree with me, feel free to upload a rival video. Feel free to counter my points and upload your own video. This is my channel, my voice. Um, so I want to just critique what I have basically observed, and this is certainly not a new thing. I've been observing it for years, and I have been involved in online debates before. Now, some people will say, "Oh, Nathan, why do you bother getting into this?" And sometimes I'm tempted to agree with them. Sometimes I think, what is the point of getting so worked up and feeling the need to always challenge them? The answer to that is quite simple. I feel that when people act in this sort of bullying manner, when they use large numbers in order to gang up on someone, it needs to be challenged. It needs to be challenged. And I'm the sort of person, if I feel something is wrong, I can't keep silent. I just can't do that. That doesn't mean I enjoy confrontation. I've taken no pleasure from the exchanges I've been through. None. It's quite stressful actually. I don't enjoy it. But I'm not even naive enough to think that I'm going to change many views. But the point is standing up to these sort of opinions, because if I don't, or if everyone took the attitude, oh well, just ignore it, then they'll continue doing it and they'll think they can continue to behave this way in other countries. Now, this is a very, very important point. When I'm talking about Chinese internet users, there's generally three sort of groups of people I'm talking about. Firstly, there are reasonable, open minded Chinese people who just want to get on with their own lives and they're not crazy nationalists, and they are open minded enough to not care about these things, to not get so um, defensive and nationalistic. I've personally known Chinese people who have been very open-minded. They've totally agreed with some of the critique that is being made against the Chinese government. Um, and I've known many people in my own life have said this time and time and time again, who have been among the most generous, decent, helpful, and likable people I've ever known, and they have been Chinese. So anyone who is thinking, "Oh, this guy is just a racist who hates the Chinese," you don't know me, and it's a complete mischaracterization of my position. So anyway, that's the first group. The second group is those who have this sort of instinctive nationalism. So they see a foreigner criticizing the Chinese government, and they feel this instinctive need to jump in and defend the particular minister in question or defend their country. And the third group is the most, in my view, the most disgraceful, um, like more worse even than the second group, and that is people who actually are employed and paid by the Chinese Communist Party. This might sound like an exaggeration, but this really does happen. Um, and it's not the only government that does it. Authoritarian regimes need a way to make themselves legitimate, to keep themselves legitimate. So they understand that laws alone are not enough to do this. So they have to employ such tactics as nationalism. Now, if the nationalism was just within China, it would be one thing. You could say, well, China's a pretty nationalistic society, which it is. But what makes me very angry is when this is exported overseas. And I have to be honest, it makes me very, very angry because the attitude is just disgraceful. And the interesting thing is, I was going to say, incidentally, with both the second and the third category, they could either be, in fact, the second category is more likely to be overseas Chinese who are either studying or, in some cases, working in a Western country or a country that doesn't block websites like Facebook. The third category, that is those employed by the CCP, are more likely to be in specially built offices in China itself, and they're actually Russia has them as well. They're actually people who are. It's basically their job to promote constant pro-party propaganda online, um, and it's total ideological warfare. That's what it is. But basically, those are more or less the three groups. So I don't see everyone as one and the same. And regarding the second group, I don't believe they're all terrible people, but I do believe they are misled and they're working with a sort of crowd mentality. It's always the same excuses. Basically, it tends to go along these lines. There's this perception, this victimhood mentality that China is being picked on, even though Western countries are criticized all the time, both in China and importantly in the West. This is the thing. This victimhood mentality totally ignores the fact. So when they say things like Western media is always picking on China, they totally ignore the fact that Western media is constantly scrutinizing Western governments. And if you don't believe me, look at Sky News, look at the way David Cameron, the most powerful politician in the United Kingdom, was put on the spot the other night over the EU referendum. Completely, completely put on the hot seat over that. That proves that we're not biased. So this idea of Chinese, of this victimhood mentality that, oh, it's the West picking on China. If that was the case, then the West would never be critical of the West. But that's not the case. Western media is constantly critical of Western governments. And that's not to say that Western media is perfect. There's many, many things I don't like about certainly the British tabloids. And I've been very critical of the likes of Fox News and other networks. So this isn't a case of saying that Western media is perfect, but it is pointing out the fact that you simply cannot have an equivalency between a situation where you have journalists asking tough questions and a situation where the entire media is controlled by one party. You know, a few of the people I was debating with accused me of hypocrisy because I was challenging their viewpoint, so they took this as to be an attack on their freedom of expression. But the real hypocrisy lies in those who are happy to live and work in Western countries and yet insult the host nation that they are in. But more to the point, they're using a banned website to do it. Now, the irony of this is incredible. If they were doing it on Weibo or QQ or Tencent, QQ or any of the other Chinese sites, at least they would be doing it in their own domain, so to speak. But when they actually come into um, Facebook and so on to promote this nationalism, it just shows how arrogant they really are. Um, and it is a strength of numbers sort of mentality because very often I've seen comments like, 1.4, you're insulting 1.4 billion, and that's nonsense. Criticizing the government is not the same as insulting people. But anyway, leaving that aside, it is basically a mob mentality because I saw people talking about me, and I knew that because I saw my name in the sentences, but it was in Chinese writing, and so they're talking about me, knowing I can't read it. My Chinese is limited; I can't read it, and it's just pathetic. So for me, the issue is this: if you those Chinese who travel outside China are pretty well off. I'm not saying they're super rich, but they're pretty well off. So if the Chinese government is so wonderful, why is it there's so many of them come outside China? Does that make sense? If the Chinese government is so wonderful, why is it that those of them who are in China use a VPN to use Facebook? Do they not stop to think, well, why is our government blocking this website? Oh yeah, because it's saying things that the Communist Party doesn't like. So the fundamental issue is this: as a base point, which society is more tolerant? The society that asks provocative questions, but where anyone can have an opinion, or the society where only one point of view is allowed? So yeah, was the journalist question provocative? Yeah, it was. But contrary to not allowing Wang Yi to have his freedom of speech, he was allowed to give his answer. It was a very obnoxious and arrogant answer, and far from showing how strong China was. A lot of these nationalists are boasting, oh, this shows how strong. No, it doesn't. It shows how sensitive China is. It shows how weak and insecure the Communist Party is in terms of critique. Western governments get criticized all the time, but you don't see Western leaders having a tantrum about it. I would argue democratic leaders have much tougher skin. The thing is, there's a basic philosophy in this. In China, Wang Yi is used to not being criticized. The only person he's going to be criticized is his boss, Xi Jinping. The media in China is completely controlled by the party, so they have no flexibility whatsoever. They can't ask any tough questions, basically. All the questions are scripted by the party. So the Communist Party is basically cowardly. They cannot handle criticism. And yet these are people who control over 1 billion lives. Now, if that's not arrogance, what is? Basically saying we can do whatever we want, including going to other countries. For what it's worth, I'm very, very pleased the Canadian government has spoken out. I see a lot of Chinese nationalists are already insulting Canada and saying, oh, China's more powerful. Well, that's questionable. Canada might be a smaller economy and it might have a much smaller population, but it's a far more advanced society in many ways in terms of quality of life, in terms of, yes, in terms of human rights. That's another point I want to raise. I've noticed a lot of people raising issues about, for example, the way Indigenous people are treated in Canada and so on. The thing is, Western countries don't have a perfect track record. Certainly, Britain right now. There's many, many areas I can criticise my country on, and I'm sure Canada's not perfect. I mean, for example, the seal clubbing I'm not particularly a fan of. Their animal rights record isn't great, and the United States is very far from perfect. But there is a fundamental difference. The argument is not to say that Western countries have no human rights problems. The argument is that Western countries are far more transparent about it. So you can talk about Indigenous people in Canada, but you're ignoring the fact that Canadian journalists Canadian human rights activists have spent years investigating and reporting on these things. There are inquiries. Here in the UK, we have an inquiry into the Iraq War. Our opposition leader, Jeremy Corbyn, has spoken about creating a process for putting the former Prime Minister Tony Blair on trial as a war criminal. Tell me, is this possible in China? Well, the Communist Party put Li Peng on trial for his role in the Tiananmen Square crackdown. No. So tell me, which society is more tolerant? That, as a base point, is the whole emphasis of this debate. They are pissed off because they simply don't like to hear foreigners criticize their government. And this shouldn't be surprising because from a very, very young age, Chinese people are basically taught that foreigners are to blame for everything and the party has made mistakes, but they sort of treat the party like their parents. Like they make mistakes, but we love them, and it's a completely fabricated education system. They say, what about your biased Western media and so on? But again, the difference is I, as a British citizen, can freely read about the crimes of the British Empire. This is a fact. In China, you cannot freely discuss or look up the crimes of the Communist Party. You just can't. So there's no equivalency. Now, when rich overseas Chinese defend the party, in a way it shouldn't be too surprising because they're the people who have gained most from the Chinese Communist Party. It should be said the Chinese Communist Party isn't ideologically socialist anymore, it's quasi capitalist. But it's like it's taken the most ugly elements of communist totalitarianism and the most ugly aspects of crony capitalism and blended them both together. And the result, and then you combine that with the ultranationalism, you get a very, very, very toxic mix. So you have the intolerance of communism crushing dissent. You have the ugliness from capitalism, which perhaps the West is partly to blame for exporting it, from crony capitalism. That is to say, you get the materialism and all the rest of it. You get exploitation of workers and all those sorts of aspects. And then you get the nationalism, which in some ways is the most threatening of all because nationalism can pollute someone's mind. It can take an intelligent, reasonable person and turn them into a frothing maniac, a frothing fanatic. I am sure some of those people I was debating with were not necessarily terrible, bad people, but the nationalism pollutes their minds and turns them into just intolerant extremists who simply will not hear any other point of view. Now, if those people had been a bit more civil and maybe said, I disagree with this journalist, but she has a right to do her job, or something like, if they'd gone along those lines, that I could accept, and I could accept that more. But some of the comments were truly disgusting. Things like, well, there were open threats, and also just calling her ugly, and uh, just all sorts of personal attacks. And this shows how vicious and nasty bullying their behaviour is. So I really firmly believe that Western governments need to be a hell of a lot more assertive. Follow the Canadian example. Yes, let's continue to have trade and, do all the usual stuff, roll out the red carpet and work in areas where there's mutual interests, anti-terrorism and so on, combating climate change. Those are areas where there's mutual interest. And I do think that we should continue to have a situation, for example, where we advocate tourism, where we promote our universities for students and so on. And honestly, hand on heart, I don't want Chinese people in the West to have a bad experience. Okay? Because when I was in China, I mostly had a good experience and I found people generally pretty hospitable. So I don't want Chinese in the West to feel unwelcome or anything like that. But I do feel that when they export that nationalism to another country, they need to be stood up to. And Western governments need to be a lot more assertive in this and say, yes, we are tolerant. We will let you, come here, study, shop, see the sights, all the rest of it. And yes, as a society that values free expression, you can have your views. But I believe that when people want to settle here, or when, even if they want to study here for a long period, there should be a waiver saying, you are now in the United Kingdom, you're not in China, or you're in Canada, you're not in China. And when you're in this country, you have to respect this country. Part of respect means not showing nationalism elsewhere. I mean, I can only imagine how these people would respond if groups of angry Britons or angry Canadians or angry French people were to wave their flags around on the streets of Beijing and say, "We demand respect." I don't think that it will go down too well. Um, so I really do think that we are too tolerant in this regard. I really do. It's almost like they have taken one of our main values, which is freedom of expression, and use it against us to attack us. And that ends up making us look rather foolish. So what I would say is this: Chinese people can criticize Western governments, they can criticize Western media, but they need to understand that not all of us are just going to sit back and tolerate it. You know, I will always welcome people to this country, people that I meet in real life outside the cyber world. You know, and if someone's respectful to me, I'll be respectful to them. But in the end of the day, this saying comes into mind: when in Rome, do as the Romans do. The simple fact of the matter is, a society that allows dissent is more tolerant than the society that doesn't. Wang Yi was not happy about the question because he's not used to it. In China, he's used to getting his own way and doing whatever he wants because the media in China has no scope whatsoever to ask tough questions. So the question rattled him, he didn't like it. And overseas Chinese people who have been brought up to blame foreigners for everything and believe that the party is never should never be criticized, then get into attack mode. And this is what always happens. So, a final few words: if you are Chinese, you can think about what you can think about this video whatever way you want. I'm beyond caring, to be quite honest. Um, all I will say is, when you're in a Western country, you have to respect Western values. That includes freedom of the press. In other words, this journalist was 100% entitled to do her job. You have to respect that. And if you can't respect that fact, you shouldn't be in a Western country. That's not to say you have to agree with her, but trying to stop her doing her job, trying to harass her, trying to silence her, is not the same as simply disagreeing with her. So I don't think it's the last time I'm going to come across this situation, and it probably won't be the last time I get involved in online debates. I am drained by it. I am fed up with it. But China is a very powerful country. But what overseas Chinese people need to understand is that by behaving this way, you're not you're not giving China a good image. That's not patriotic. What you're actually doing is damaging China. You're damaging China's brand, China's image, because you're making China look like a very aggressive bully that thinks it could do whatever it wants. That's how you come across. A lot of people were saying, "Oh, why doesn't she ask questions about the Canadian government?" I looked at her timeline. Actually, she did have questions about the Canadian government. So just try and inform yourselves about how press freedom works and compare a country that has it with your country, which doesn't. If you're watching this video right now and you're in China, you are using a VPN. Is that true? Is it true? If you are a Chinese person in the West, then you're either studying or working here, which means that you should respect the host nation that you're in. Simple as that. When I'm in China, I respect China. You know, I don't go around and say about how wonderful Britain is, and I have been to China, by the way. I didn't go around and boast about how great my country was and how no one can ever criticize it. I could have. Xinhua is constantly making xenophobic attacks on other countries. But I didn't, because I wanted to focus on my own experience. I just wanted to, I wanted to meet my friends, I wanted to do my job and all the rest of it. If all you can think about is nationalism, what does that say about you? So, in the West, we shouldn't sell our values. We should be tolerant. We should allow different points of view. But I do think the Western governments need to be much more assertive and, like I say, follow the Canadian lead by simply speaking out and saying, when you're in our country, you respect our values. Simple as that. And I would have no problem with heads of state actually saying this or leading politicians. Because the Chinese Communist Party needs to understand they can't call all the shots. Because the world is getting sick of their arrogance. It isn't just Western countries, it's other Asian countries. Look at the way they're behaving in the South China Sea. Whatever the rights and wrongs of that area, even if China does have legitimate claims, the way it's going about it isn't helping, building fake islands. Right now, this is how China appears to the world. This is my honest, outside summary of how China appears to the world. A fascinating country with a very rich history, very long history. A powerful country, but a country that is also getting increasingly nationalistic and increasingly arrogant. That is an outsider's perspective of China, and I'm not alone in that regard.